The gavel struck marble 3 times, and the entire vampire court went silent. Zara Vaughn stood in the center of the Obsidian chamber, 40 feet below the streets of London. Her white coat still stained from the emergency surgery she had abandoned 40 minutes ago, when 2 pale, cold hands had materialized in her hospital office and told her she had no choice. Her stethoscope hung at her neck. Her dark hair was still pinned back with the surgical clip she had forgotten to remove. She was 31 years old. She was terrified, and she refused to let a single creature in this room know it. The chamber was extraordinary and horrifying in equal measure. Black stone walls rose 30 feet to a vaulted ceiling, carved with scenes of conquest and bloodlines. 7 vampire lords sat in carved obsidian thrones arranged in a crescent, their white hair falling like frost, their pale skin practically luminous under the blue-flamed torches. 300 lesser vampires packed the gallery tiers above, their eyes ranging from silver to deep crimson, all of them fixed on her, and chained at the center of the chamber, kneeling on a raised dais of black granite, was Lucian Mordaine, the most powerful vampire lord in Western Europe, the ancient, the one they called the Pale Sovereign, the vampire who had, over the last 8 months, become the most important person in Zara Vaughn's life, though she had never intended for that to happen, and had argued strenuously with herself that it absolutely could not be allowed to continue. He was still extraordinary, even chained. Even now, white hair loose around his shoulders, silver eyes steady and burning, jaw set with the particular brand of aristocratic contempt that she had come to recognize, meant he was genuinely afraid and would rather be executed than admit it. The chains were carved from obsidian and threaded with gold-veined iron, and she knew enough about vampire blood law now to understand that such restraints were specifically designed to suppress a lord's power. They had prepared carefully for this. They had intended to take him. The charges against Lucian Mordaine, called the Pale Sovereign, Lord of the Northern Seat, are as follows, the central judge announced. His name was Vale Druscan, and he had silver eyes so pale they were nearly white, and a voice that carried the specific kind of casual cruelty that came from centuries of unchallenged authority. Violation of the blood law of isolation, concealment of a mortal attachment, breach of the Immortal Charter, Section 9, which forbids a lord of the court from forming a bond of protection with a human civilian without formal blood declaration, and most critically, the undermining of court supremacy through the harboring of a human witness to vampire affairs. The gallery erupted. 300 voices, low and hissing and cold. The judges carry the penalty of dissolution, Veldruscan continued, and the chamber went quiet again, because dissolution was not death in any ordinary sense. It was the destruction of a vampire's power, their title, their blood memory, everything that made them what they were. It was worse than death. Everyone in this room knew it. However, Veldruscan said, and here he looked directly at Zara, his pale eyes carrying something that was not quite a smile. The court has agreed to hear testimony from the mortal woman, as per the ancient right of spoken defense. If she can prove before this court that Lucian Mordaine has maintained his separation from mortal attachment, that he is unchanged, that he remains what he has always been, and not a creature compromised by human sentiment, the charges may be reduced. He paused. Or she can prove the opposite, and we will dissolve him here and now. Zara understood immediately. This was not a defense. This was a trap, beautifully constructed, logically airtight, and almost certainly already decided. If she argued that Lucian felt nothing for her, they would demand proof. If she argued that he did feel something for her, she confirmed the charges. They wanted her here so that her own words, in either direction, would condemn him. They had brought her not as a witness but as a weapon, as she looked at Lucian. He was watching her with those silver eyes, and for just a moment the aristocratic mask slipped, and she saw what was underneath it. Not resignation, not surrender, something quieter and more devastating than either. He did not want her to do this. He had not wanted her brought here at all. She straightened her spine. She set her stethoscope more deliberately around her neck, the way she did before difficult conversations with families in waiting rooms, the way she anchored herself. "Very well," Zara Vaughn said, and her voice carried clearly through the chamber. "I will testify. She had 8 months to draw from. 8 months that had begun, of all places, in a hospital parking garage at 2 in the morning. She had been 23 floors above street level, finishing a double shift in the cardiothoracic unit when the call came, not a hospital call, a different kind. Her phone had rung with a number she did not recognize, and the voice on the other end had been calm, measured, and specific. There was a man in the parking structure on level 3 who had been shot 3 times and was losing blood at a rate inconsistent with survival. He was not a man who could go to any other hospital. If she wanted to save him, she needed to come now and ask no questions about what she saw. She had gone, she would always maintain somewhat defensively, that she went because she was a doctor and it was a medical emergency, which was entirely true. The fact that the voice on the phone had been the most compelling thing she had ever heard in her life was irrelevant. What she found on level 3 was a figure propped against a concrete pillar, dressed in clothes that cost more than her monthly salary, his white hair dark with blood, and 3 gunshot wounds in his chest that should have killed him twice over. His eyes, when they opened, were silver. His skin, when she pressed her gloved hands to the wounds, was cold in a way that had nothing to do with blood loss. "You are the doctor," he said, "not a question." "Clearly," she said, and began assessing the damage. She did not ask what he was. She was a thoracic surgeon who had spent 6 years seeing things that defied easy categorization, and her immediate priority was the bleeding. The rest of it, the pale skin, the cold temperature, the way the wounds were already beginning to close at a rate that was not physiologically possible, she filed away under things to process later. He watched her work with an expression she would come to know well, pure, unguarded astonishment, as though no one had ever treated him with brisk professional competence before. "You are not frightened," he said. "I am extremely frightened," she said, calmly pressing a surgical dressing to the worst of the wounds. "But you are bleeding, so I am doing my job first, and being frightened later. Be quiet and breathe, or whatever it is you do." He was quiet for approximately 4 seconds. "I breathe," he said, "slower than you, but I breathe." "Fascinating. Now stop talking." His name, she learned later, because he told her nothing useful that night, was Lucian Mordaine. He was, by any human measure of the word, ancient. He had been born human in what was now Romania, in a century she could not quite make herself process without a drink, and had been turned at the age of 28 by a vampire lord, who had long since dissolved into legend. He had ruled the northern seat of the European vampire court for longer than England had been a kingdom. He was, by every metric available to the court, one of the 5 most powerful vampires in existence. He was also, she discovered over the weeks that followed, deeply lonely in a way that seemed to have calcified around him over centuries until it was simply part of his architecture, like so stone walls that had been standing so long that the mortar had become the wall itself. He came back to her. That was the thing she had not expected. She had patched him up and sent him away with wound dressings that were probably pointless, given what she was beginning to understand about his biology, and she had thought, quite firmly, that this was finished. Unusual night, moving on. 2 weeks later, a black car was waiting outside the hospital at the end of her shift, and the driver, a pale, sharp-featured vampire who introduced himself as Orvain and looked deeply disapproving of the entire situation, informed her that Lord Mordaine wished to speak with her. "Lord Mordaine can wish for things all he likes," she said, and got into the car because she was curious and because she was apparently incapable of making sensible decisions when sufficiently intrigued. What followed was the strangest dinner of her life, in a private dining room beneath a Mayfair building that turned out to be the public-facing entrance to a much larger and older structure. Lucian Mordaine sat across from her in a chair that managed to function as a throne through sheer force of his presence, wearing a suit that was perfectly tailored and somehow suggested armor, and explained, with surprising directness, that she had saved his life, that the vampires who had shot him had been attempting a politically motivated assassination, and that, as a result of this event, she was now technically a witness to vampire affairs, and therefore in a certain amount of danger. "You are telling me this is your fault," she said. "Yes, and that you feel responsible. Yes, and that you intend to do something about it." "Yes," he said, and something in the set of his jaw changed fractionally. "If you will permit it." She should have said no. She knew she should have said no. She said no for 3 weeks, returning his calls, responding to his careful, formal messages, meeting with his people, to receive briefings about the nature of the political situation she had apparently been dragged into, and repeatedly telling him that she did not need protection, and was perfectly capable of managing her own safety. On the 4th week, someone broke into her apartment. They were not vampire. They were human, which was somehow more frightening, because it meant someone had hired them. She came home from a night shift to find her front door unlocked and the shape of a man in her kitchen. And what happened next was 4 seconds of pure adrenaline terror before the window opened from outside and Lucian Mordaine came through it like something out of an entirely different genre of story, fast and cold and furious, and the man in her kitchen made a sound she never wanted to hear again and was gone. Lucian stood in her kitchen afterward, checking her face with his hands, his silver eyes doing that thing they did when he was feeling something he had not yet decided to acknowledge, moving over her features with an attention that was more thorough than any medical examination she had ever conducted. "I am fine," she said. "You are shaking, yes. Both of those things can be true simultaneously." She pulled her chin from his hands, though it cost her something she was not ready to name. "How did you know to be here? I have had people watching your building. Without telling me, you told me you did not need protection. So you just went ahead and provided it anyway." "Yes," he said, with absolute calm and zero apology. She should have been furious. She was furious. She was also, beneath the fury, something she refused to examine, which was deeply, inconveniently moved. They argued for 40 minutes. It was one of the best conversations she had ever had. He was brilliant and immovable and occasionally maddening, and he listened to her with the complete attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what she thought, rather than waiting for her to finish so he could redirect. By the end of it, They had reached a negotiated arrangement. He would assign protection, she would be informed of everything, and she would have complete veto power over the methods used. She moved into a protected apartment 2 days later. It was considerably nicer than her old one. She told herself this was irrelevant. Over the months that followed, she learned him the way. She learned anatomy, methodically, and with growing recognition that this was something she was going to know for the rest of her life, whether she intended to or not. He came to the protected apartment regularly, always with a reason, always with information about the ongoing situation regarding the assassination attempt, always with a formality that felt increasingly like a man who had decided to be very careful about the edges of something, and was succeeding by sheer discipline. She learned that he read obsessively and had strong opinions about historical revisionism. She learned that he genuinely loved music in a way that was almost embarrassing for someone who projected that much regal authority, that he would stop mid-sentence if something came on in the background that moved him. She learned that he was protective of the humans under his territory in a way that seemed to run against what she understood about vampire court politics, that he had established quiet arrangements with mortal governments that he maintained at personal political cost. She also learned that the assassination attempt had been organized by a faction within the vampire court itself, vampires who were opposed to Lucian's more measured approach to human relations and wanted a lord who would sever all political compromise and return to older, harder ways. They called themselves the Purists. Their leader, she eventually understood, was Lord Vale Druscan, the same Vale Druscan who was now seated in the central throne of the Obsidian Chamber, watching her with pale eyes and waiting for her to destroy Lucian with her own words. She had been standing in the center of the chamber for 30 seconds, maybe less. It felt like longer. Time worked differently when 300 pairs of ancient eyes were fixed on you. "Speak, mortal," Vale Druscan said. "The court is waiting." Zara looked at Lucian one more time. He was watching her, and his expression was doing the thing it did when he had made peace with something he could not control. She recognized it. She hated it. She turned to face the court. "You want to know if Lucian Mordaine is compromised," she said clearly. "If his attachment to a human has diminished him, made him less than what he was, less than what the court requires him to be." "We want the truth," Vale Druscan said. "Then let me give it to you," Zara said, "but I am going to give you all of it. Not just the parts that serve your framing." A ripple through the gallery. She did not look up at it. "I am a cardiothoracic surgeon," she said. "I have spent 6 years studying the human heart and everything that can go wrong with it. And I can tell you, clinically, that what I have observed in Lucian Mordaine over 8 months of close proximity is not weakness. It is not compromise. It is not the diminishment of an ancient lord reduced by sentiment." She paused. She let the silence sit. "What I have observed is consistency, an absolute, unbroken consistency of character. He intervened to save my life at personal political cost. He negotiated protection through channels that preserved my autonomy. He shared intelligence that endangered his own position in order to keep me informed. Every action, every decision has been made within a framework of strict honor, not human honor, something older and more rigid and far less comfortable." She was moving now, not pacing but pivoting, addressing different sections of the gallery because she had spent 6 years giving difficult family briefings, and she understood viscerally that you had to make an audience feel seen. "You are calling this a violation of blood law." But I have read the charter you referenced. Section 9 does not prohibit a protective bond. It prohibits a bond formed in secret with the intention of undermining court authority, and I would like to present the following point for consideration. She looked at Vale Druscan. This court knew about me within 6 weeks of the first incident. Lord Mordaine's location trackers, his communication records, his political correspondence, all of it is accessible to the court archivists. As required by charter, he did not hide me, he did not conceal the arrangement. If this court chose not to act until now, that is not concealment on his part, that is a political decision on yours. Dead silence, complete, absolute silence. And then she did the thing she had planned and simultaneously dreaded since the moment they brought her into this chamber. You asked for proof of his humanity, she said, and what I am about to tell you is not evidence of his humanity at all. It is evidence of something else. Something your blood law has no category for, which I think is actually your problem, not his. She turned to face Lucian directly. He was very still. I have watched this man make every decision available to him through the lens of what was right and honorable, even when it cost him, even when the political consequences were severe, even when the easier path was directly in front of him. She let her voice drop slightly, not for effect, but because she was approaching something honest and it required a different register. He is not compromised by feeling. He has always been this way. I did not change him. What I did was give him a situation in which what he already was became visible, and apparently that visibility is what this court cannot tolerate. Vale Druscan's pale eyes narrowed. You are confirming that a bond exists. I am confirming that a principled lord made principled decisions, and you are framing it as a crime because it does not serve your political goals, Zara said, which brings me to my final point. She reached into the inner pocket of her white coat and removed a sealed document. She had taken it from Lucian's cabinet 3 days ago, when Orvain had come to her apartment white-faced and told her that Vale Druscan had filed charges and that the hearing was in 72 hours. She had spent those 72 hours in the protected apartment, not sleeping, reading every piece of vampire court documentation she could get Orvain to bring her, because preparation was the only tool she had and she intended to use it comprehensively. Under Blood Law Section 41, which predates Section 9 by approximately 3 centuries, a lord who has survived a documented assassination attempt by a court faction retains the right to invoke the Sovereignty Clause, which protects all actions taken in the defense of their own continued authority from being reframed as violations in subsequent proceedings. She held up the document. I have here a full documentation of the assassination attempt of 8 months ago, the ballistic evidence, the payment records tracing back to a financial instrument controlled by Lord Druscan's faction, and the sworn testimony of 3 vampires who were present during the event. Under the Sovereignty Clause, every decision Lord Mordaine made in the months following that assassination, including his protective relationship with me, was a legitimate exercise of survival authority. The gallery had erupted again, louder this time. Zara stood in the noise and did not move. Vale Druscan rose from his throne. He was very tall, and when he straightened to his full height, the blue-flamed torches behind him threw his shadow enormous across the stone floor. "You are a mortal woman," he said, and his voice was soft now, which was more frightening than when it had been formal. "You are standing in the oldest court in Western Europe, surrounded by creatures who have existed longer than your nation, and you are presenting legal arguments, yes. Zara said. I am also a trauma surgeon. I am comfortable working under pressure in hostile environments. Something shifted in the chamber. She could feel it, the way she felt the shift in an operating room when the procedure turned a corner. And you knew, not absolutely but nearly, that the patient was going to make it. Then Vale Drusson did something she had not anticipated. He smiled. The court will recess, he said. 30 minutes. The guards moved forward, and Zara felt her stomach drop. Because she had not planned for a recess. She had planned to finish this now, and a recess meant they were regrouping, meant Vale Drusson was having conversations she could not hear, meant the trap was reassembling around her. They did not escort her out. They brought Lucian to her, or rather, they brought both of them to a small antechamber off the main hall, still guarded, still clearly contained, but for the next 30 minutes alone. The door closed, and Lucian crossed the room in 3 strides, and his hands were on her face before she had time to prepare for it. Both palms curved around her jaw, cold and careful, and trembling very slightly in a way she had never from him before. You should not have done that, he said. His voice was stripped down to something underneath the Lord, underneath the Sovereign, something much older and more desperate. You are welcome, she said. Zara. Her name in his mouth had always been different from how anyone else said it. She had stopped pretending she did not notice this. They brought you here to use you. I did not want you here. I specifically instructed Orvain that under no circumstances should you be informed of the proceedings, because I did not want. You did not want me to have to choose, she said. I know. Orvain told me that part. He told me, so, that I would understand why you had not called. And then I told him that withholding that information from me was both paternalistic and medically unethical, since I was the one whose testimony was being sought. And he looked at me with that expression he has, and then he brought me everything I asked for. Lucian stared at her. You were preparing. For 72 hours, yes. You knew about the sovereignty clause. I know about it now. I found a very old text. Orvain translated the relevant sections. He was very still for a long moment, and then something happened in his face that she had seen twice before in 8 months, both times in moments of significant extremity. His composure did not break. It simply became transparent, and underneath it she could see everything he was. The documentation, he said, the evidence you presented, those records are sealed under court authority. The only way you could have accessed them is if someone inside the court provided them. Someone inside the court did provide them, she said. Who? She met his silver eyes. Lord Castvale. Lucian went absolutely still. A Castvale was the oldest member of the court, a vampire so ancient that he rarely spoke in proceedings, a figure the court essentially orbited without being able to directly influence. He had also, 8 months ago, been in the vehicle ahead of Lucian's when the assassination was attempted, and had thus narrowly escaped it himself. Castvale helped you, Lucian said. He helped me help you, he said, and I am quoting directly because I memorized it, that he had watched Vale Drusson construct this particular trap for 3 months, and that it was architecturally elegant but morally repugnant, and that he had been waiting for someone stubborn enough to dismantle it. She paused. He seemed to find me amusing. He finds very little amusing. He is 4,000 years old. Well, apparently I am exceptional. Something broke open in Lucian's expression. It was not quite a smile, because she was not sure he entirely knew how to do that without layers of architectural distance. But it was the direction of one. It was warm and helpless, and completely at odds with every inch of his regal, bearing. "You are," he said quietly, and his thumbs moved just slightly along her cheekbones. "You are extraordinary, and you should not be here, and I am entirely, selfishly grateful that you are Lucian." She put her hands over his, not removing them, just covering them. "I need you to understand something. I am not here because I felt obligated. I am not here because you are a case I need to resolve or a patient I need to save." She held his gaze. "I am here because you matter to me, personally, in a way that I have been fighting for approximately 7 months, and which I have recently decided is genuinely not worth fighting anymore." The silence between them had a different texture after that, fuller. "The blood law," he said. "If I were to declare formally as a court lord that I have a human bond, the political consequences would be significant. I read that section too. The court would demand a blood declaration, a formal binding commitment of protection, recognized under ancient law. It would make you a target for every faction opposed to me. I am already a target. I am standing 40 feet underground, surrounded by 300 vampires who were all listening to me argue blood law at them 20 minutes ago. This would be permanent," he said, and his voice was very careful, very deliberate, the way it got when he was saying something that cost him. "A blood declaration is not like a human contract. It cannot be undone. If I declared you under my protection formally, you would be bound to vampire court politics for the rest of your life. And you," she said, "would be bound to honoring it for the rest of yours, which is considerably longer. Yes, and you are telling me this because you want to be certain I understand what I would be agreeing to. Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. This impossibly ancient, unexpectedly gentle, thoroughly infuriating man who had come through her window in a crisis and argued with her about autonomy, and read history books with strong opinions and loved music with embarrassing sincerity, and had apparently spent 8 months being very careful about the edges of something because he understood, better than she did at the time, exactly how serious it was. "I am a doctor," she said. "I do not make decisions without understanding the full weight of them. Tell me all of it. Right now, while we have 20 minutes. So he did. He told her everything, the full scope of what a blood declaration meant under vampire court law, the protections it conferred and the vulnerabilities it created, the political enemies it would cement and the unlikely alliances it might forge. He was precise and complete and entirely honest, including the parts that were frightening. She listened without interrupting, which she gathered from his expression was something he was not accustomed to. When he finished, she said, "Is there any version of this where I just get a normal life and you visit me sometimes?" "No," he said. "I didn't think so." She exhaled. "And is there any version of this where you walk away and I go back to my hospital and we never see each other again and you are politically safe?" He was very quiet for a moment. "Technically," he said, "if I renounced the protective arrangement and you provided testimony that the bond was transactional and is now dissolved, the charges might be reduced. I would face censure, but not dissolution. But you would not make it 6 months before Druskin's people tried again," she said, because she had read all the documents, including the political analysis Mordaine had quietly prepared, and she was not going to pretend she had not. "Probably not," he agreed. "So the only version of this where you are actually safe long-term is the one where you have formal court recognition of the bond, which gives you the political armor of a declared commitment and makes attacking you an attack on a declared partnership rather than as a solo lord. That is the argument Castvale made to me 3 months ago, Lucian said, when I refused to act on it, because I would not use you as a political shield without your knowledge and consent. She stared at him. You have known this for 3 months, and yes, and you did not tell me. No, because you did not want me to feel pressured into agreeing to something enormous as a solution to a political problem. Yes, she let out a breath that was half law and half something she could not entirely categorize. You are, without question, the most frustrating person I have ever met in my life, and I work in a hospital, so that is genuinely saying something. I imagine it is. I am also, she said, and her voice changed, quieter, more real, deeply, specifically moved by that. Just so you know, that you chose to carry it alone rather than put it on me. Even though it was the wrong decision, it was a very you decision. And I have apparently reached the point where very you decisions move me rather than aggravate me, which is alarming. He leaned his forehead against hers, and the gesture was so quiet and so human and so completely at odds with every inch of regal containment he carried that she felt it in the center of her chest, like a physical pressure. What do you want, Zara? He asked. It was the simplest question he had ever asked her. I want you not to be dissolved, she said. I want Druskan to fail. I want to go back upstairs and finish this and win. And then I want to figure out the rest of it properly, without a court of ancient vampires watching us. She pulled back just enough to look at him. Can we do that? With you standing next to me? He said. Yes. The guard knocked on the door. 30 minutes. They walked back into the obsidian chamber together, and the ripple through the gallery when they entered, side by side, was different from any sound she had heard in this room yet. It was not hostile. It was something older, more ambivalent. Recognition, perhaps. The court seeing, whether it wanted to or not, what was actually in front of it. Vale Druskan had reordered himself. His expression was composed, his posture perfect, his political armor reassembled. But Zara had been reading people in crisis for years, and she could see in the very slight rigidity around his eyes that he had not found in the last 30 minutes what he had hoped to find. The recess concludes, he said. The court will hear final statements. I have one question, Zara said, before he could redirect. For Lord Druskan directly. A pause. This is not standard procedure. The ancient right of spoken defense permits the mortal witness to address the court directly and without interruption for the duration of their testimony, Zara said. I checked. I am still testifying. Another pause. She held his gaze. Ask, Vale Druskan said. The assassination attempt 8 months ago, she said. The financial instrument that paid for it traces to an account in the name of Druskane Holdings, which is a subsidiary of your family's estate trust. The documentation I submitted contains full tracing records. I want to give you the opportunity, on the record, to offer an alternative explanation. The silence that fell over the obsidian chamber was a completely different quality from the ones that had preceded it. This one had weight. It had consequence. Vale Druskan's pale eyes had gone to something she could not read. Behind him, 2 of the other seated lords were exchanging glances. In the gallery above, the sound of 300 vampires holding absolutely still. Those records, Vale Druskan said carefully, are classified under court seal. Lord Castvale released them under the authority of eldest review, Zara said, which is one of 5 mechanisms by which sealed records can be lawfully presented in an open proceeding. I also checked that. She tilted her head. The question stands, my lord. Do you have an alternative explanation for the financial tracing? Lord Castvale. ancient and still in his throne at the far end of the crescent, spoke for the first time. His voice was very quiet and carried without effort, the way voices did when they had had 4,000 years to develop gravity. The court will note that the witness's question is procedurally valid and must be answered. Vale Druscan's composure held, barely. This proceeding was convened to evaluate Lord Mordaine's fitness. It was convened, Castvale said, on charges that have now been materially complicated by counter-evidence. The court does not selectively hear facts. If it did, it would not have stood for 3,000 years. A pause. Answer the question, Vale. What happened next happened in approximately 12 seconds, and Zara would spend a long time afterward reviewing each moment of it in her memory. One of the lords to Vale Druscan's left, a woman whose name Zara did not know, with dark red eyes and white hair in elaborate braids, rose from her throne. Then the lord to his right rose as well. And then, behind him, the gallery shifted, not all 300 but enough, a visible, audible withdrawal of weight. Vale Druscan looked at the room, and then he looked at Zara, and in his pale eyes she saw something she had not expected to see. Not fury, but calculation, rapid and cold, the look of someone reassessing whether the battle was still winnable. He sat down. "The charges against Lucian Mordaine," he said, in a voice entirely stripped of ceremony, "are withdrawn." The chamber erupted. Zara stood still in the center of it for a moment, letting the sound wash over her, and then someone took her hand. She looked down. Lucian's hand, cold and certain, his fingers laced through hers with the particularity of someone who had decided something and was not going to be ambiguous about it. She held on. It took another hour to complete the formal procedural requirements, the withdrawal of charges, the registration of the sovereignty clause argument, the sealing of the assassination documentation into formal court record. Lucian stood through all of it and gave the court exactly the performance it required from a lord who had just been exonerated, composed and regal and appropriately measured. But his hand did not leave hers for a single moment of that hour, and she suspected, from the quality of attention in the gallery, that everyone present understood exactly what that meant. Lord Castvale, departing, paused beside her. He was very old, and it showed not in any obvious physical way, because vampires did not age visibly, but in something about his stillness, the way ancient trees were still, rooted so deeply that weather could move through them without moving them. He looked at her with dark eyes that had a depth she found genuinely unnerving. "You read 3 centuries of blood law in 72 hours, he said. "I had help with the translation," she said. "I provided accurate translations. The reading and the argument's construction were yours." He tilted his head fractionally. "I have watched 1,400 proceedings in this chamber. That was the most interesting one." "I am glad someone found it interesting," she said. "I found it fairly terrifying." "Yes," he said, "and you were terrified and you did it anyway, which is the relevant characteristic." His dark eyes shifted briefly to Lucian and then back. "He has been alone for a very long time. Vampire lords who hold their seat as long as he has tend to become their function. Court, authority, blood law. The self calcifies." He looked at her again with that unreadable depth. "You introduced a variable he had stopped being able to introduce himself. I am grateful for that." He moved past her without waiting for a response, which she gathered was the privilege of 4,000 years. They left the Obsidian Chamber at 3 in the morning, emerging through the network of tunnels that connected to a private entrance beneath the Mayfair building, and when the door closed behind them, and they were in the elevator going up, and the marble and obsidian and blue-flamed torches were below them. Zara leaned against the wall and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for the entire night. Lucian stood across from her in the elevator. He was watching her with those silver eyes, and the expression she now recognized as feeling too much and organizing it with difficulty. "The sovereignty clause argument," he said. "Yes. You found it in the ancient register. Mordaine took me to the document archive at the court annex. He was very reluctant. He kept saying that it was highly irregular. I told him that irregular was my preferred mode of operation. He told me," Lucian said. "He sent me a message during the recess that said, and I am quoting, 'She is managing everything and I am merely carrying books.'" Zara smiled, and she felt the smile all the way through her, warm and real and too big to contain properly. To be fair to Mordaine, they were very heavy books. The elevator stopped. They stepped out into the private suite above, and the city lights came through the tall windows. London at 3 in the morning, ordinary and glittering and entirely indifferent to what had happened beneath it. Lucian crossed to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out, and she let him have the moment because she had learned, over 8 months, that he sometimes needed the geometry of space to say the things that were difficult. "I need to dress something formally," he said. "The blood the night ends." She waited. "What I explained to you in the antechamber, if you wish to consider it, the process would need to begin within the court's current session, while the sovereignty clause is active and working in our favor. After 30 days, the political leverage changes." "So you are asking me now," she said. "I am offering you the choice now," he said, with the particular precision he used when the difference between those two things mattered to him. "You should not feel pressured by timing. If you want more time, I will manage the political calendar. What I will not do is make this choice for you." She crossed the room and stood beside him at the window. They were the same height, nearly, which she had always found interesting, given the weight of authority he carried. The city spread out below them, ordinary and vast. "8 months ago," she said, "you were bleeding in a parking garage and you told me you were not a man who could go to any other hospital. I did not know what you meant at the time. I meant that I could not risk exposure of our kind through standard medical channels. I know. But afterward, I kept thinking about it. You said it so matter-of-factly. Not a man who could go anywhere else. And you called me specifically. You had done research. You had identified someone you trusted with the information, and then you just told me. No pretense, no cover story you were. It was necessary. It was trust," she said, "even if it was necessity-shaped. You trusted me with something that could have destroyed your world before you knew anything about me, except that I was a surgeon, and I answered my phone." She looked at him. "I have been thinking about that for 8 months. He turned from the window to face her. "I think," she said carefully, "that the way you trust people, when you do it, is permanent and complete, and it costs you significantly to do it, and you do it anyway when you believe it is right. And I think that is what this is." She met his silver eyes. "I want the declaration. Not because of the political timing, because I have been standing at the edge of this for 8 months, telling myself I needed more time, and what I actually needed was to be in a room full of very ancient vampires, being told I was going to lose you to understand that I do not want more time. I want the time I have with you." Something crossed his face, something complete and unguarded, and very bright for a creature who lived in the dark. "You understand what you are agreeing to," he said. I am a doctor. I always understand what I am agreeing to. Your life will be more complicated. My life already involves performing surgery on people who have been shot and going to underground courts to argue ancient blood law, she said. I think the complexity bar has been set. He made a sound that was absolutely and undeniably a laugh. A real one, short, startled, and genuine. The kind that happened when something caught you before you could manage your response to it. She had never heard it before, and it hit her somewhere central. Yes, I have not said it directly. I should say it directly. You should, she agreed, because she was not going to make this easy for him out of misplaced sympathy. Because he had made very few things easy for her. He took her hand, both of his hands around hers, the careful way he always held it. I love you, he said. I have loved you for approximately 7 months, and I have been telling myself it was protection and responsibility and obligation, and it was all of those things also. But what it was most was love, very specific, very complete, very entirely fixed on you. He looked at her with those extraordinary silver eyes. I do not say it casually, it is a permanent thing. In my experience, love of this kind does not diminish with time. In your experience, she said, her voice slightly unsteady in a way she could not entirely prevent. How long is time? Long enough that I am confident. She reached up and put her free hand against his face, the way she had wanted to do, since approximately the 3rd time he came to her apartment with information and stood in her kitchen being careful about edges. His skin was cool under her palm. His eyes were very still. I love you too, she said. I have been making terrible arguments to myself about why I should not for months, and I am tired of the arguments. She pressed her palm slightly more firmly to his cheek. I love you, and I am going to take the declaration, and I am going to keep practicing medicine, and you are going to stop making unilateral decisions about what information I need to protect my feelings, because we established that this is both paternalistic and medically unethical. Are we agreed? We are agreed, he said. And there was that direction of a smile again, that warm, helpless thing underneath the Lord. He leaned down and she leaned up, and the kiss was careful. At first, the way both of them were careful people who had spent 8 months being very precise about the edges of this. And then it was not careful at all, because they were also both people who committed completely once they committed. And this was the end of a very long night and a very long 8 months, and London sparkled below them, indifferent to everything. The blood declaration was filed with the court 3 days later. Lord Castvale witnessed it, which provided a level of political authority that Lucian told her, quietly, was essentially untouchable. The formal language was ancient and elaborate, and Mordaine translated every line for her before she signed anything, because she had made very clear that she would not agree to documents she had not fully read. The court received it. Vale Druskin, facing a formal inquiry into the assassination documentation, now that it was in the public record, had his attention occupied elsewhere. The 2 lords who had risen from their thrones during the proceeding came to Lucian privately, and expressed, with varying degrees of grace, their respect for how the matter had been handled. The woman with the red eyes and braided hair, whose name was Lady Serphael, told Lucian that his mortal companion had the best legal instincts she had seen in a proceeding in 2 centuries, which she delivered with a kind of reluctant respect that Zara found more satisfying than she probably should have. Mordaine, presented with a thank-you gift of an extremely good book on Renaissance architecture that Zara had found, based on a passing comment he had made about enjoying the period, looked at the book, and then at her, and then out the window, in the manner of someone whose composure was under mild pressure, and said, very quietly, that he hoped she would be happy. "I intend to be," she said. "Good," he said, and returned to his scheduling with the air of a man whose professional world had been reorganized around a new variable and who was, if pressed, not entirely opposed to the adjustment. What followed in the months after the declaration was not simple. Zara had understood it would not be, and she had agreed anyway, which was its own kind of statement. There were political meetings she had to attend, vampire court functions, where she was assessed and occasionally challenged, situations where the nature of the world she had entered made ordinary life complicated. She kept practicing medicine, kept her surgical schedule, negotiated the strange intersection of two worlds, with the same methodical competence she brought to everything. Lucian was protective, which she had anticipated, but he was protective in ways that actually helped rather than constrained her, which had been her primary concern. When a court faction sent someone to her hospital to make a point, he handled it with controlled precision and no collateral damage, and gave her a full briefing within the hour. When she was called before a secondary court function to be assessed by lords, who did not believe a human woman had the standing she had been given, he sat beside her in full authority and watched with silver eyes and said nothing, because she had asked him to let her handle it herself, and she had handled it herself. And afterward he told her with complete sincerity that she was the most capable person he had met in 4 centuries, which she suspected was true, and which moved her considerably. She moved into the house eventually, the real one, the old building in Mayfair that went much further down than the street suggested, and had rooms that felt like libraries and smelled like old stone and centuries, and windows that in certain rooms faced east, so he never had to think about the sun at all. She kept her hospital privileges. She continued to practice. She added, over time, a small number of vampire patients whose physiologies she was developing a genuinely unprecedented expertise in, which was academically fascinating and extremely restricted in terms of who she could discuss it with. She published under highly creative pseudonyms and with very careful data modification 3 papers on anomalous cardiac presentation in patients with unusual physiological profiles. They generated quiet but significant interest in certain specialist circles. She found this privately very satisfying. Lucian read everything she wrote, including the surgical journal articles on ordinary human cardiac cases, which he clearly found interesting primarily because she had written them. She found this privately very satisfying also. One evening in the early spring, almost a full year after the night in the parking garage that had started everything, she came home from a late surgery to find him in the library with 3 history books open and a 4th under argument, which was his normal reading posture, and he looked up when she came in, the way he always did, immediately and completely, the way he always tracked her when she entered a room, an attention so total it had stopped startling her and started feeling simply like orientation. "How was the surgery?" he said. "Successful. Mitral valve replacement, 63-year-old, minor complications, excellent outcome." She dropped onto the settee near his chair and pulled her feet up under her. "How was the court?" "Tedious. Seraphiel proposed a revised charter amendment that has merit, but will take 3 sessions to push through the Conservatives. Castvale said 4 words across the entire proceeding, and they were enough to shift 2 votes, which continues to be extraordinary. He turned a page. Mordaine has found a new book on Renaissance architecture. I know. I ordered it for him. He looked at her over the top of the book with that look that was by now fully and entirely a smile, the one that had taken the better part of a year to fully emerge, that lived now on his face with something like ease. She loved him so much, it was occasionally difficult to look at directly. The way bright things were difficult to look at directly. She looked anyway, because she had decided some months ago that looking away from things you loved because they were intense was a poor use of a life. The inquiry panel, she said, because they had been waiting for news. Filed today. Druskin is formally under investigation for the assassination funding. He set the book down. The process will take time. He will not be dissolved quickly, but he will be occupied, and his political influence will be diminished significantly throughout. Good enough for now? Good enough for now, he agreed. She looked at him in the lamplight, this extraordinary, complicated ancient man who had backed at her 6 times when he could have simply sent messages, who had sat in her kitchen and argued with her about things he fundamentally disagreed with, because he wanted to know what she thought, who had spent 8 months being careful about edges until she forced the question in an underground chamber in front of 300 vampires at 3 in the morning. Lucian. Yes, I am glad I answered the phone. He put the book down completely. His silver eyes were very steady and very warm in the lamplight, which still occasionally surprised her, how warm those cold eyes could be. As am I, he said. Every day, with increasing certainty, she reached out her hand. He took it with both of his, the way he always did, the careful way that had become over time the most familiar gesture she knew. The lamplight made the library gold and old and quiet. Outside London went on being London. The ordinary world above an extraordinary one, each oblivious to the other in most ways, and deeply entangled in the ways that mattered. Zara Vaughn had a declaration of protection under ancient blood law, 3 pseudonymous academic papers, an ongoing surgical practice, and the specific and permanent love of a vampire lord who had spent centuries being careful about edges and had finally, conclusively decided to stop. It was not a simple life. She had never particularly wanted a simple one. In the mornings, she went to work and saved people's hearts. In the evenings, she came home to a man who could not see the morning, but who had been keeping other kinds of vigil for longer than she could genuinely conceptualize, and who had decided, with all the complete and irreversible commitment of something that had had centuries to understand what commitment meant, that she was worth every complication, every political consequence, every adjustment to a world that had not previously had room for her in it. She had decided the same thing about him in the early weeks when she was still telling herself she was just being a doctor, and then progressively through the months when she was telling herself she was just being responsible. And finally, definitively, in an obsidian chamber at 2 in the morning, when a court of ancient vampires demanded, she proved something, and she stood up and described him instead, not his humanity. That was never what the court had truly been asking. What they had wanted was her to define what he was, and in doing so diminish it, reduce it to a category they could evaluate and dismiss. She had described him instead, what he actually was, and what she had found describing him was that there were not enough categories in all of blood law and ancient charter and the 3 centuries of proceedings Lord Castville had watched to contain a person who was principled and lonely and brilliant and careful and funny in the particular way that required you to be paying close attention, and who had come back to her 6 times when he could have sent messages that had been her testimony. Not a legal argument, though she had made those too. A true one. The declaration held. The court held. The love held, as it tends to do when it is built on the right things, trust and truth, and the particular stubbornness of 2 people who have both decided that this is the thing worth being stubborn about. In the spring, Lucian rearranged his east-facing rooms so that her medical journals had a permanent shelf, and the settee in the library was replaced with one long enough for 2 people to share, and Mordaine updated his scheduling to account for the standing commitment that was not any longer procedural or protective or political. It was simply what it was. What it had been building toward, without either of them fully admitting it, since a night in a parking garage when a bleeding vampire lord in expensive clothes had opened his silver eyes and said, "You are the doctor," not as a question but as a recognition. Yes, she thought, even now, she was the doctor. She was also, it turned out, the woman who had walked into an underground court and described him to his enemies with more love than law, and won. She held his hand in the lamplight, and the spring rain moved against the windows, and London went on below them, vast and ordinary, and entirely unaware of how thoroughly it was loved by 2 people sitting in a library above it, one of whom had a heart that beat, and one of whom did not, and both of whom were, for the first time in a very long time, and in ways that mattered more than duration, entirely and completely home.